My stepson stood in my living room, the living room I'd paid for, in the house I'd built, and told me that the reading of my brother's will would go smoother if I wasn't there. He said the family needed closure, and my presence complicated things. My wife of 14 years stood 3 feet away and studied the pattern on the rug. She didn't say a word, so I gave them exactly what they asked for. I stepped back, all the way back, and before I walked out that door, I made sure every single thing I'd quietly built over those 14 years walked out with me. What I left behind on the kitchen counter was a single sheet of paper. It took them 4 days to understand what it meant, and by then, it was already too late. But before I tell you how I dismantled the life they thought they owned, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you believe that the people who underestimate a quiet man make the most expensive mistake of their lives. My name is Donald Hargrove. I'm 63 years old, and for the last 14 years I was the invisible infrastructure of a family that treated me like a utility bill. Necessary, unremarkable, easy to forget about until the service stops. I spent 32 years as a tax attorney at a firm in Nashville, Tennessee. I built my career on patience and precision. In my world, the man who moves first rarely wins. The man who moves correctly always does. I married Cheryl in 2009, 2 years after her first husband, Raymond, died of a heart attack and left behind a modest life insurance policy, a used Buick, and 2 adult children who resented the world for their father's mortality. Cheryl's son, Brandon, was 26 when we married. Her daughter, Kayla, was 23. They were polite at the wedding the way strangers are polite at a doctor's office, civil, distant, counting the minutes. I told myself it would take time. I was patient. I paid off Cheryl's credit card debt, $31,000, in the first year of our marriage. I helped Brandon get his contractor's license by co-signing on the bond he couldn't qualify for alone. I put Kayla through the last 2 years of her nursing degree when her financial aid fell short. I never kept score out loud. A man with my background knows better than to call a favor when it suits him. I kept score in my head, the way I kept everything clean, documented, and ready. For 11 of those 14 years, things were tolerable, not warm, but functional. I was the man who handled the problems, the leaking roof, the IRS notice Brandon got after his first year in business, the refinancing of Cheryl's mother's house. I was called when something was broken and forgotten when it wasn't. Then my older brother, Gerald, died in March. Gerald and I had been close since childhood. He was the one who'd driven me to my LSATs in the rain, the one who'd lent me the money for my first year of law school before I won the scholarship that made it unnecessary. He'd never married, never had children. His estate was considerable, a piece of commercial property in Murfreesboro, a brokerage account, and a ranch house on 40 acres outside of Franklin. We'd talked about it over the years. Gerald had always said the property would come to me. It was family land. Our grandfather had worked it. What I didn't know was that Gerald had also told Cheryl this during one of the Sunday dinners she'd attended without me over the years. And somewhere between those dinners and Gerald's death, Cheryl had told Brandon, and Brandon, being Brandon, had already begun to think of that 40 acres as his future. The will reading was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at Gerald's attorney's office in Franklin. 3 days before, Brandon came to our house. He sat in my living room with his boots on my coffee table and his jaw set like a man who'd rehearsed something and didn't want to lose his place. He said the family had been talking. He said that given the emotional weight of Gerald's passing, it might be easier for everyone for the siblings, he said, meaning Gerald's distant cousins, who'd appeared from nowhere the moment death was announced, if I attended by phone rather than in person. He said my presence in the room created tension. He said sometimes grief needs space. I looked at my wife. Cheryl had her eyes on the floor. I had spent 14 years watching that woman, and I knew every variation of her silence. This was not the silence of a woman who disagreed and was afraid to say so. This was the silence of a woman who had already agreed, in another room, without me, and was simply waiting for the conversation to be over. I set down my coffee cup. I nodded slowly. I told Brandon I understood completely. He looked relieved. He clapped his hands on his knees and stood up and said, he knew I'd see it that way. He said I was a reasonable man. I am a reasonable man. That's exactly what makes me dangerous. I didn't call my own attorney that night. I called Marcus Webb, the only man I trust with anything that matters. Marcus had been my law school roommate and was now one of the most respected estate litigators in Middle Tennessee. He owed me 3 favors going back to 1998, and I had never collected on a single one. "Marcus," I said, "I need to collect." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me everything." I talked for 2 hours. By the end of it, Marcus had his yellow legal pad full, and I had my first full night of sleep in a week. The next 3 days I played my role perfectly. I was attentive. I was warm. I brought Cheryl coffee in the morning. I offered to help Brandon price out a job he was bidding on. I let them believe that the conversation in the living room had settled something. I let them believe that I was adjusting. What I was actually doing was building a foundation. Gerald's attorney had already confirmed to Marcus that the will was exactly what Gerald and I had discussed. The Franklin property, the brokerage account, and the ranch came to me in full. But there was a complication that I had known about for years and never mentioned to Cheryl. Gerald had named me the sole trustee of a family preservation trust that also held the deed to a vacation cabin in Gatlinburg, a cabin that Cheryl's family had been using for 3 summers running, driving up on long weekends as if it were their birthright, as if the key I'd given them was a gift rather than a courtesy. I called the cabin management company on Tuesday morning. I advised them that effective immediately, the access code would be changing, and all future reservations not made in my name would require my written approval. The woman on the phone said she understood and updated the record. Then I called the cosign bond company and requested a review of the contractor bond I'd guaranteed for Brandon. I had not violated any terms, the bond was current, but I informed them that I would not be renewing my guarantee at the end of the current term in November. They noted it and said they'd send the paperwork. Then I sat with Marcus for 4 hours, and we went through every financial thread between me and this family, every account, every co-signed document, every courtesy I had extended that had quietly become an assumption. There were more threads than I expected. 14 years is a long time to be generous. The will reading happened on Thursday without me. I sat in Marcus's conference room and listened by phone, as Brandon had requested. The attorney read every line. The Franklin property, to Donald Hargrove. The brokerage account, to Donald Hargrove. The ranch, to Donald Hargrove. I listened to the silence in that room, the way you listen to weather coming in off a mountain. It had a particular pressure to it. On the drive home, Cheryl called me 3 times. I let it ring. She was home when I arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with her reading glasses pushed up on her head, holding a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. She started carefully. She said she hadn't known the full scope of it. She said Brandon was upset. She said that Gerald had always seemed like he might, and here she paused and chose her words with the delicacy of someone stepping around. Broken glass had always seemed like he might consider the family as a whole. I sat across from her. I told her I understood. I did understand. I understood that for years, in the background of my marriage, a parallel conversation had been happening. A conversation about what I had and what they deserved. A conversation in which I was the resource and they were the recipients. I had not been invited to that conversation. I was simply expected to fund it. I went to bed early. I let Cheryl think it was grief. Over the next 10 days, I moved with the same patience I'd spent 3 decades developing. I engaged a commercial real estate broker to begin a quiet listing on Gerald's Murfreesboro property. Not a public listing, a private outreach to a developer I'd worked with on a client matter in 2017. The man had been trying to acquire property in that corridor for years. He responded within 48 hours. We agreed on a number, contingent on clean title, which Marcus was already preparing. I liquidated the brokerage account Gerald had left me, routing the proceeds to an account in my name only that I had opened at a credit union across town, an account Cheryl had no knowledge of and no access to. I contacted my own attorney, not Marcus, but the woman who drafted my prenuptial agreement 14 years ago, which Cheryl had signed without, I believe, fully reading. The agreement was precise. Any asset I inherited would remain my separate property, regardless of the length of the marriage. I had insisted on that clause quietly, and Cheryl had agreed cheerfully, the way people agree to terms they don't believe will ever be enforced. My attorney reviewed everything and confirmed what I already knew. My position was clean. Then I addressed the one thing that required personal courage rather than legal maneuvering. I went to Brandon's house on a Saturday morning. He was in his driveway drinking a gas station coffee and looking at his truck with the expression of a man who knows something is wrong with it but doesn't want to find out what. I parked and walked over. I told him I wanted to clear the air. He relaxed visibly. He thought I was coming to capitulate. I told him I had been thinking about our relationship, mine and his. Over the 14 years I had been married to his mother. I asked him to walk me through, from his perspective, what I had contributed to his life. I told him I was genuinely curious. I told him I wanted to make sure I understood what our relationship had meant. He frowned. He listed a few things vaguely, imprecisely, the way people describe something when they haven't thought about it because they didn't need to. He said I'd helped out here and there. He said I'd been around. I helped out here and there, I said. I repeated it calmly, like I was confirming a deposition answer. I told him I wanted him to know that I would not be renewing the guarantee on his contractor bond in November. I told him I wished him well and that I hoped his business was strong enough to qualify on its own at that point. I told him I was sure it was. He went very still. I told him that the Gatlinburg cabin access code had been changed and that any future use by his family would require a request submitted in writing at least 30 days in advance, which I would consider on a case-by-case basis. His face cycled through 3 different expressions before settling on anger. He said I was being vindictive. He said all they'd asked was that I give the family some space at a difficult time. I told him I was giving him space. A lot of it. I walked back to my car. I didn't raise my voice. I never do. That evening, Cheryl came to me in my study. She closed the door behind her, which she rarely did. She sat in the chair across from my desk and folded her hands in her lap. She said she'd heard from Brandon. I nodded. She said she thought we needed to talk about the estate, about what it would mean for us, for the family, moving forward. She said she'd been thinking that maybe now that we had some financial security, she said I noticed, we had, as if the inheritance were a joint arrival, it might be time to think about helping Brandon expand his business. A real investment, not just a bond guarantee. She said she thought Gerald would have wanted the resources to stay in the family. I looked at my wife. I looked at the woman I had driven to her mother's chemotherapy appointments for 8 months in 2015. The woman whose kitchen I had renovated as a surprise for her 55th birthday. The woman who had stood 3 feet away while her son told me to absent myself from my own brother's estate proceeding. I told her I thought that was an interesting perspective. I told her I was going to take some time to consider everything. She seemed reassured. She reached across my desk and touched my hand. She said she knew it had been a hard few weeks. She said we'd get through it together. Together, I thought. There's that word. I waited until she was asleep. I went back to my study and I spent 3 hours making a list. Not of grievances, I'd made that list years ago and kept it updated the way I kept everything. I made a list of transactions, every debt I had absorbed, every asset that touched my name that had, over time, come to feel like a shared resource without ever being legally shared. I was systematic about it. I was clinical. By midnight, I had a document that looked less like a marriage audit and more like a closing statement. The following Monday, I had breakfast with Marcus at a diner near his office. I brought the document. He read it quietly, turning the pages with the careful economy of a man who knows how to absorb information without reacting to it. When he finished, he set it on the table and drank his coffee. He asked me what I wanted. I told him I wanted a clean exit, not a destructive one. I wasn't interested in scorched earth. I was interested in accuracy. I wanted every financial courtesy I had extended to be accurately reclassified in every relevant document as what it was: my money, my decision, my property, not family resources. Mine. Marcus nodded slowly. He said he could do that. He also said something I had not anticipated. He said that based on the prenuptial agreement and the documentation I'd compiled, if I chose to file for divorce, Cheryl would likely receive nothing from the estate assets. The marital estate itself was modest, a jointly purchased home with a remaining mortgage, 2 vehicles. The prenuptial agreement was precise about inheritance. I asked him about the house. He told me. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked him how long it would take to have everything prepared. He told me 3 weeks if we moved efficiently. I told him to move efficiently. Those 3 weeks were the strangest of my life. I went home every evening. I had dinner with Cheryl. I was courteous. I was even, occasionally, warm, not because I was performing, but because some part of me that was separate from the accounting still remembered who she had been to me, in the good years, in the early years, before I understood the geometry of what I was living inside. I say that not to make myself sympathetic. I say it because it's true, and I made a decision a long time ago only to say things that are true. On the last Thursday of that 3-week period, I was ready. I had retained a full-service relocation company to handle the contents of my study, my books, my files, the leather chair I'd had since 1994. They came while Cheryl was at her Thursday morning book club, a precision I had arranged deliberately. I directed them to a storage unit in my name on the east side of the city. I spent that afternoon making 2 phone calls. The first was to the mortgage company. I was the primary borrower on the house. I confirmed that autopay from my personal account would be discontinued as of the following billing cycle and provided them with the updated contact information they would need. The second call was to my financial advisor. I removed Cheryl as the beneficiary on my retirement accounts and designated, in her place, the Children's Hospital at Vanderbilt, to which I had always meant to give more than I had. Then I went to the kitchen. I placed a single envelope on the counter. Inside was a letter, 2 pages, typed and signed by me. It explained, in plain language, that I had filed for divorce that morning, which I had, via Marcus, and that the terms of our prenuptial agreement governed the distribution of assets. It confirmed that the house mortgage would require her attention by the next billing cycle. It noted that my guarantee on Brandon's bond would not be renewed. It confirmed that the Gatlinburg cabin was my property alone. It was not cruel. It was not cold. Exactly. It was accurate. It was the most honest thing I had written in years. I also left, next to the envelope, the key to the storage unit. Because Cheryl had always loved my collection of first edition Tennessee history books, and I had moved them there rather than keep them. I didn't want them. I wanted her to have something real from the end of this. And those books were real. I picked up my bag, which had been packed for a week, and stored in my car. I walked out of that house for the last time on a Thursday afternoon in October, when the light in Nashville comes in low and gold and makes everything look better than it is. I didn't look at the flower beds Cheryl had planted. I didn't look at the porch swing. I got in my car and I drove. I spent the first 2 nights at a hotel near the airport. On the 3rd morning, Marcus called to tell me that Cheryl had retained an attorney. He told me the attorney had reviewed the prenuptial agreement and was already walking her back from a challenge. He said her attorney was competent enough to know when a document was airtight. On the 4th day, I drove to Franklin. The ranch, Gerald's ranch, now my ranch, was 42 acres of mixed cedar and open pasture, with a creek running along the eastern fence line and a view from the back porch that changed every hour, depending on where the sun was. Gerald had kept a small herd of cattle and a man named Ernest who managed the property and had been doing so for 11 years. Ernest was 67 and he shook my hand at the gate and called me Mr. Hargrove and then asked what I wanted done with the winter feed order. I said to proceed as Gerald had always done it. He nodded like that was the only sensible answer. I sat on the back porch that afternoon with a glass of iced tea and watched the light change on the pasture. I had my phone with me. It buzzed twice, once with a message from Brandon, which I did not open, and once with a message from Kayla, who had never once called me anything but Donald and now opened with, "I just want to say, on behalf of all of us, that we hope you'll reconsider. On behalf of all of us." I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the porch railing. I did not reconsider. What came next happened faster than I expected, and also exactly as I expected. Brandon, without my bond guarantee, could not qualify for a major commercial contract he had bid on in October. He lost the contract. His business took on debt. He called my cell phone 9 times in 8 days. I did not answer. He left one voicemail that was angry, and one that was quiet and almost desperate, and the desperate one was harder to hear, because I am not a man who enjoys the suffering of people, even people who have earned it. I simply know the difference between suffering that has a lesson in it and suffering that deserves a remedy, and I knew which one this was. Cheryl's attorney submitted her response to the divorce filing on a Tuesday. Marcus called me that afternoon and summarized it. She was asking for spousal support based on the length of the marriage and her reduced earning capacity. She was challenging the prenuptial agreement on grounds of inadequate disclosure. She was claiming an interest in the Gerald estate based on, and this was the part that required me to set down my coffee and look out the window for a moment, based on verbal assurances she said I had made to her about our financial future. I had made no such assurances. I had made no promises I didn't put in writing, ever, about anything. 32 years as a tax attorney will do that to you. Marcus presented, in response, 6 years of bank statements, the prenuptial agreement with independent counsel signatures, Gerald's will with attestation, and a notarized summary of every financial transaction I had made on behalf of Cheryl or her children during the marriage, each one documented as a gift from me to them, not a marital asset. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. The judge reviewed the prenuptial agreement and found it valid. She noted that it had been signed voluntarily, with independent counsel available, and that the terms were clear. The claim of verbal assurances was unsupported. Spousal support was denied on the basis that the marital estate, the house equity, minus the outstanding mortgage, was to be divided equally, giving Cheryl approximately $62,000. When Marcus called to tell me the ruling, I was standing in the barn at the ranch watching Ernest show me how Gerald had organized the tack room. I thanked Marcus. I asked him to ensure the settlement transfer was processed cleanly and promptly. He said he would. Then he said, "Don, for what it's worth, I've never seen someone manage something this painful, this quietly." I told him I'd learned it from watching other people do it loudly and lose. That was 8 months ago now. Ernest and I have gotten into a rhythm. He handles the cattle and the fencing. I handle the paperwork, the taxes, the vendor relationships. Twice a week I drive into Franklin to have coffee at a diner on the square, and I'm beginning to know the names of the regulars. I've started attending the early service at a church Gerald loved, where 3 people have already invited me to things and meant it. I finished reading through Gerald's personal papers last month. He had kept everything: letters, photographs, receipts from trips we took as kids. I found a letter he'd written to me but never sent, dated from about 5 years ago. He said he had seen what my life was costing me, and that he hoped I knew my own worth, and that when the time came, he hoped I'd let the land be the thing that steadied me. I folded that letter and put it in the drawer of the desk in my study, here at the ranch. My study now, my desk, my window looking out over 42 acres that have belonged to my family for 2 generations. Brandon got his bond renewed through a different guarantor, I'm told. He's managing. I hope he is. I hold no pleasure in his struggle, only in the accuracy of the boundary I finally drew. Kayla called me once, about 3 months after the divorce was final. She didn't ask for anything. She said she was sorry for the way things had gone. She said she thought I'd always been fair to her. I told her I appreciated that, and I meant it. We didn't talk long, but it was honest, and that was more than I'd expected. Cheryl and I have not spoken. We probably won't. There's nothing dishonest about that. Some endings aren't dramatic. They're just complete. I'm sitting on the back porch now, as I often do at this hour. The last of the October light is holding on above the ridge, the same long gold I remember from the day I drove away. My coffee has gone cold and I haven't minded. Ernest's truck is kicking up a thin line of dust on the far fence road. Everything I have, I built. Everything I kept, I earned. And everything I walked away from, with both hands clean. If you believe that a quiet man's patience is the most dangerous force in any room, hit that like button and tell me in the comments, do you think I was too cold about all of it? Or did every person in that story get exactly what they chose? I want to hear from you, and I'll be right here.